history, heritage. They play such strong roles in who we become and how we act in the world. His story, his. Already, a heritage of patriarchy shows up within our very word for the story of what built us. Our heritage, like our DNA, provides building blocks from which we construct ourselves. I want to give you an example from my own his story. I've shared before how my maternal grandparents were a great source of love and care in my life, how they welcomed my spouse Wayne as a much-loved member of our family. And yet, they were Southern Baptist and of a different generation. They were from, as our reading earlier noted, a time of less knowing. So, when Wayne and I were with my grandparents, they and we never openly discussed that we were a couple. And of course, back then, legal marriage equality was only a distant dream. Even though they loved us both greatly and we them, this vital aspect of our lives was left unspoken. Until my grandmother was nearing the end of her life, we were visiting her for what turned out to be the last time she would let herself be put into a hospital. As we said our goodbyes, got ready to leave, she took us both by the hand, locked her eyes with mine, and said, "Take care of each other." In that brief moment, her love broke through what had been implicit and made it explicit. She gave to me and to Wayne an inheritance of limitless loving given to her by her ancestors. She broke through that heritage of less knowing. And so I come from a heritage of taking care of one another, and one where love was demonstrated both physically and verbally. I think that may be, at least in part, a source of my calling to ministry, and before that, an adulthood spent in mostly nonprofit work and anti-oppression, anti-racism, social justice activism. Yet, I also come from a heritage wherein my grandfather was a deacon in one of those Southern Baptist churches, where there were norms against expressing uncomfortable truths aloud. Significant aspects of our lives had to be left unacknowledged. And though it has often been hard for me to reconcile myself with emotionally, I also hold a heritage of patriarchy, racism, anti-LGBTQ-ism, and so many other isms handed down to me from within my family, as well as the community and indeed the country in which I grew up. So while my family story involved a legacy of offering care, that care sometimes came with unspoken requirements. Like when my family would invite anyone to Christmas dinner if they found out they were spending the holiday alone, and yet a silent code required everyone to stay in their place according to race, gender, orientation, etc. As I've gone about the work of social justice and ministry, I have had to persistently unlearn an inheritance of privilege hierarchies, supremacy cultures. I expect it's this way for most of us, if not all of us. We all have to deal with impersonal karma, the things left unfinished that Carl Jung referenced in our call to worship, the impulse to deny the truth of diverse human experiences that Adrienne Marie Brown highlighted in our reading. We all come from a long story that runs through multiple generations, and our story is a large part of who we are. We can change the plot, though. We can draw from our heritage that which creates more love, more justice, more fulfillment in our lives and our world. We can choose to leave behind legacies of pain and harm. Now, this same dichotomy of inheritances has also been handed down to us by our Unitarian Universalist ancestors, as well as those of this church. Just as a few examples, here in the U.S., both our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors were early supporters of abolition, women's suffrage and rights, new ways of educating children, a host of social services for people in need. They were among the first predominantly white denominations to ordain African American ministers and women as ministers. And yet, the book, The Iowa Sisterhood, tells the stories of Unitarian and Universalist women who forged difficult but ultimately successful ministries in the Great Plains states of the 19th century, but were never accepted by most of their male colleagues. In fact, they entered these small, struggling, then frontier parishes to begin with because they couldn't get placements in the more established churches of New England. Likewise, black pioneers in a white denomination reveals the tale of the Unitarian minister Ethelred Brown, who left Jamaica to attend our Meadville Unitarian Seminary in the early 20th century, even though he had been told by that seminary that he would be unlikely to get a placement in any of their virtually all-white churches. And that turned out to be true. So, Brown founded an African American Unitarian church in Harlem. And that church became extraordinarily successful, only for Brown to find himself kicked out by the Unitarian Association because he was too radical, which meant he was a socialist who dared to demand true equality for black folks. He was only reinstated after he threatened a lawsuit. Our great Unitarian minister Theodore Parker was an abolitionist, even at a time when some other Unitarians and Universalists supported slavery. He kept a gun in his pulpit because he and his church were helping slaves escape to the North and to Canada. He preached thunderously against slavery and said that, quote, slavery tramples on the Constitution. And yet, he also said some terribly racist things that I will not repeat here today. A legacy of less knowing. More recently, after the Unitarians and the Universalists merged, we UUs have been at the forefront of civil rights, women's rights, environmentalism, LGBTQ rights, and so many other movements for social justice. And yet, we have suffered repeated incidences of racism, misogyny, and the like within our own institutions. In 1968, a group of black Unitarians and their white supporters walked out of our Unitarian Universalist National General Assembly because of disagreements over whether the Black Affairs Council would be funded and structured in a way that empowered them to manage their own affairs. Now, this has become known as the Black empowerment controversy, maybe though it might be better remembered as the white supremacy culture affair. More recently, in 2017, the president of our Unitarian Universalist Association and other upper staff resigned over a controversy surrounding a BIPOC final candidate for one of our regional lead positions. She was told, quote, "You're not a good fit." A white guy hired another white guy for the position. These are just a few examples of a dichotomy within our UU heritage. And likewise, the story of our church contains tales of great commitment to our faith and values, as well as some challenges along the way. Going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, this church was active in women's suffrage, feminism, and civil rights. We helped fight for the desegregation of Barton Springs Pool, and after that, all pools in Austin. Throughout its history, the church has supported numerous charities. We've been active in LGBTQ rights from very early on and helped the Capital Area Men's Chorus get started. From its beginnings, we were active in the struggle against AIDS. We helped launch 2 of the other UU churches in our area, as well as our U-Bar-U Retreat Center in the Hill Country, and another LGBT supportive church of a different denomination in our area. Over the years, our church members have carried our religious values into leadership roles in our community, roles in the arts, higher education, music, medicine, poetry, theology, politics, well, you name it. One of our resident historians, church member Luther Elmore, discovered that former Texas Governor Ann Richards was a member of this church. She served as either board secretary or board treasurer. No one can seem to remember which, but we have inarguable proof that she signed that membership book in 1969. Philosopher Charles Hartshorne, one of the major contributors to process theology, which has become a sustaining worldview for many UUs, including me and many other people in liberal religion, Hawthorne was also a long-term member of this church. So we are rooted in an ancestry of justice-making, honest theology, human equality. And yet, just for example, the church only called its first female settled minister, Meg Barnhouse, in 2011. We've had a couple of female interim ministers before that, but hey, at least after that, the church went big, bringing on several more female ministers and 2 more LGBTQ ministers besides Meg since then, plus a wonderfully diverse group of guest ministers. And like our larger UU faith, we have also had our fair share of controversies over the years. I had the pleasure of visiting one of our long-term church members who lived to be over 100 years old, not long before she died. She got to recounting stories about the church while we visited. At one point, she stopped, looked at me, and said, "Take it from me. I've been with that church for a long time, and it's one of the best religious communities anywhere, and I argued with those people more than anyone in my life." Well, again, these are just a few examples. If you want to know more about our church heritage, our other resident historian, Leo Collis, has posted QR codes like the one on this column throughout the church that bring you some of that history. Look for small signs with an Easter egg printed on them. Again, like me with my family, we can learn from when our heritage has sometimes failed to live up to our professed values. At the same time, we can also receive with gratitude the commitment to progress, justice, and human dignity our ancestors bequeathed to us. I'll close by noting that, of course, we live in a country in which our ancestors have also left us this dichotomy of inheritances, a country about which attorney, activist, and commentator Van Jones wrote, "From the very beginning of this country, America has been two things, not one. We have our founding reality and our founding dream, and the two are not the same." So, our heritage includes slavery, racism, violence, subjugation of Native Americans and the theft of their lands, voting disenfranchisement, imperialism, and the denial of the very existence of LGBTQ folks, just to name a very few. A his story told not just to center males, but that has also tried to erase the contributions and perspectives of those with different heritages. Again, women, BIPOC folks, LGBTQ folks, and more. Erase these from the formative stories of our country. And yet, our heritage also includes that founding dream articulated by our ancestors, that beautiful vision of the self-evident truth that we are all created equal. So once again, we can draw from our heritage that which creates more love and more justice and leave behind legacies of pain and harm. We inherit a heritage of racism. We inherit a heritage of patriarchy. We inherit a heritage of heterosupremacy and gender orthodoxy. We inherit a heritage of enforced and reinforced income and wealth inequality and so many other inequalities upon inequalities. We inherit a heritage of often violent and even lethal oppression and injustice. And yet, we also inherit a heritage of all people are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We inherit a heritage of we shall overcome and I have a dream. We inherit a heritage of suffragettes and Stonewall, and make love, not war, and feminism, and ACT UP, and womanism, and Occupy Wall Street, and Save Our Planet, and Black Lives Matter, and Me Too, and Rock the Vote, and on and on and on. We inherit a heritage of love and justice and inherent worth and dignity for all. So the question becomes, what parts of our heritage shall we pick up and pass on? What of our heritage shall we amplify? And what shall we leave behind? Right now, in this moment, and in all of our days, for some future someones, we are the ancestors. What heritage will we leave them? What inheritance shall we become? Our choices can create seeds of hope for future generations. May that be our story. Our women, our men, blessed be.